The boy was found at dawn, when the fog still clung to the ground like it had unfinished business. He lay beside the railway spur, just beyond where the city stopped pretending it cared. No blood marked the stones. No signs of struggle disturbed the weeds. If not for the pale skin and the unnatural stillness, he might have been sleeping, waiting for a train that never came. No wallet, no phone, no scars that told a story. Just a boy, maybe 12, maybe younger, dressed in clothes that were clean but old, like they had been preserved rather than worn. The body was discovered just before sunrise, when the fog still pressed low against the ground and blurred the edges of the city into something uncertain. A railway maintenance worker had noticed a shape beside the abandoned spur, too still to be debris, too deliberate to be trash. The police tape went up quickly, but the place itself seemed resistant to disturbance, as if the ground had already decided this moment would remain untouched. The boy lay on his side, knees slightly drawn in, hands folded loosely near his chest. There were no visible wounds, no blood soaking into the gravel, no torn clothing to suggest panic or resistance. Death had arrived quietly, almost politely, and that was what made it unbearable. He was young, but not so young that his age could be guessed with confidence. His face carried a softness that hadn't yet been shaped by adulthood, but his expression was calm in a way that felt practiced. His clothes were outdated, not in the sense of poverty, but as if they belonged to another time entirely. A faded jacket, carefully buttoned. Shoes worn but clean. Nothing in his pockets except lint and a single smooth stone, placed there deliberately. The absence of identification was striking, but more troubling was how intentional that absence felt, like someone had gone to great effort to remove every thread that might lead back to a name. As officers documented the scene, inconsistencies began to surface. The ground around the body was damp from the night's mist, yet the boy's clothing showed no sign of moisture. His hair was dry, neatly combed, untouched by wind or rain. There were no footprints leading toward or away from him, no drag marks, no indication of how he arrived there. It was as if the boy had simply appeared, placed gently beside the tracks when no one was looking. Even the insects seemed hesitant, circling but not settling, as though something about him warned them away. When the detective arrived, he felt the wrongness immediately. Crime scenes usually spoke in fragments, violence, haste, mistakes, but this one was silent. Too orderly, too restrained. The boy's face showed no fear, no confusion, no pain frozen into the muscles. Whatever had happened to him had not been a struggle. That realization carried its own horror, because it suggested trust. Someone the boy did not run from. Someone he believed would not hurt him. The detective noted the way the boy's hands had been positioned, almost ceremonially, and how the body had been angled to face the rising sun. A detail no accident could explain. The detail revealed itself only after the initial photographs were taken and the body was prepared for transport. In a place where rusted metal, oil stains, and decades of neglect coated everything, the boy's hands looked strangely out of place. The detective noticed it while standing a few steps back, something about the contrast tugging at his attention. The fingernails were short, evenly cut, and free of grime. Not a trace of dirt clung beneath them, not even the faint discoloration that comes from ordinary play or travel. They were the hands of a child who had recently been washed, cared for, and corrected, not the hands of someone who had wandered into an abandoned rail yard alone. He asked the forensic technician to take closer photographs, and under magnification the oddity deepened. The skin around the nails was smooth, unbroken, with no hangnails or rough edges. Even the cuticles were intact, pushed back neatly as if someone had taken their time. In an environment where adults struggled to keep clean, where grease and soil worked their way into every crease, this level of care felt deliberate. It suggested a moment that did not belong to the crime scene itself, a moment somewhere else, somewhere safer, where warm water and soap had been used with patience. The detective imagined the act, not as violence, but as preparation. Someone kneeling in front of the boy, guiding his hands under running water, scrubbing gently, checking each finger before moving on to the next. It was an intimate act, the kind usually reserved for parents or guardians, and that intimacy raised uncomfortable questions. If the boy had been treated with such care so recently, how had he ended up dead in a place like this? Why make him clean only to discard him among broken tracks and weeds? The detail refused to align with the rest of the scene. The boy's shoes were scuffed but tidy, his clothes free of fresh stains. There were no defensive injuries on his hands, no scratches, no signs of a struggle. Clean nails meant he hadn't clawed at gravel or fought for balance. He hadn't tried to escape. That absence of resistance told its own story, one where fear never had the chance to surface. The detective felt a quiet dread settle in, the kind that comes not from brutality, but from control. As the body was lifted, the detective caught one more glimpse of the boy's hands, folded calmly as if instructed to remain still. The care taken with something so small felt more disturbing than any wound could have been. It implied planning, intention, and a twisted sense of order. Whoever had done this did not see the boy as disposable in the moment of death, but as something that needed to be arranged properly before being left behind. A contradiction that suggested the crime was not driven by impulse or rage, but by a purpose that had been decided long before the boy's fingers were ever clean. The search for the boy's identity should have been routine, a procedural sweep through missing person reports, shelter intakes, school absences, hospital admissions. The detective expected at least a whisper of a match, some bureaucratic echo that confirmed the child had existed before that morning. Instead, the databases returned nothing. No recent reports. No cold cases that fit the age. No photos that triggered recognition. It was as if the boy had slipped through every net designed to catch the lost. That absence felt heavier than any discovery, because systems are built to fail imperfectly, not completely. Hours into the search, an anomaly appeared. An old juvenile case file surfaced in an archive so outdated it was rarely accessed, its digital spine buried beneath layers of newer records. The system flagged it not because it matched the boy, but because it behaved strangely when opened. The detective clicked the file, and for a brief moment the text shimmered, the letters blurring as though wet ink had been disturbed. He leaned closer, assuming a screen error, but the words sharpened again, rearranged slightly, as if settling into place after being watched. The case itself was sealed, marked incomplete, its contents restricted by an authority long since retired. It referenced a child taken into protective custody years ago, name redacted, age approximated, origin unknown. The notes were sparse, clinical, and unsettlingly vague. Each page carried the sense that something had been intentionally omitted. Dates overlapped. Signatures didn't match. Entire paragraphs were blacked out, not digitally, but scanned from a physical document that had been censored by hand. The detective noticed that some of the redactions bled through faintly, like pressure had been applied too hard, leaving impressions beneath the ink. What unsettled him most was the timestamp. According to the system, the file had been accessed minutes before he found it. By him. Except he hadn't searched for it, hadn't known it existed. When he checked the access log, his name appeared again and again, scattered across years when he hadn't even been on the force. Someone, or something, had been using his credentials retroactively, touching the file just often enough to keep it from being forgotten, but never enough to draw attention. As he scrolled, the text shifted once more, subtle but undeniable. A line that had been unreadable moments before became clear, describing a child who could not be placed, who did not respond to questioning in expected ways, who spoke as if recalling events that had not yet occurred. The detective felt a chill creep through him, the sense that the file was not merely recording history, but reacting to his presence. This was not a forgotten case resurfacing by chance. It was a sealed memory resisting exposure, and the boy on the tracks was no longer just a victim, but a reminder that something buried had begun to surface again. The first witness came forward reluctantly, pulled in not by duty, but by fear that had begun to outweigh his instinct to stay silent. He was a night shift security guard who worked the warehouses near the rail line, a man accustomed to shadows and movement that meant nothing. He insisted he wasn't mistaken, insisted on repeating the same details even when interrupted. 3 nights before the body was found, he had seen the boy walking along the service road during a heavy rain. Not running, not hiding, just walking slowly with his head slightly bowed, as if listening to something no one else could hear. At first, the detective dismissed it as grief-driven imagination or the common human urge to insert oneself into tragedy. But the guard's account carried an uncomfortable precision. He described the boy's clothes exactly as they were found, right down to the faded jacket and the way one sleeve sat slightly shorter than the other. He remembered the time because it coincided with a system reboot, remembered the rain because it had soaked through his own boots. He remembered stopping to watch because something about the boy felt wrong, like seeing a reflection move independently of its source. The detail that shifted the story from unlikely to impossible was what came next. The guard said the boy didn't leave footprints. The road had been coated in soft mud from construction runoff, the kind that held tire tracks for days. The guard himself had left clear impressions when he stepped out of his booth to look more closely. But the boy's feet, though visibly touching the ground, disturbed nothing. No marks, no splashes. Even the rain seemed to avoid him, falling around his body instead of soaking into the fabric. The detective visited the site that same night, standing where the guard claimed he had watched. The ground still bore the memory of rain, hardened now, but the footprints from that night remained, preserved like fossils. The guard's prints were there, just as he'd said. The boys were not. Cameras in the area offered no help. One angle showed a vague shape moving through the rain, distorted by static, present in one frame and gone in the next. Timestamps jumped forward by seconds without explanation, as if the recording itself had flinched. The most disturbing part of the testimony came at the end, offered quietly, almost apologetically. The guard said the boy had looked up as he passed the booth, not startled, not curious, but aware. Their eyes had met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment the guard felt certain the boy knew he would later be found dead. Not afraid of it, not resisting it, simply continuing forward, already moving beyond something that had not yet happened, as if death was not behind him on the tracks, but waiting patiently somewhere ahead. The autopsy was supposed to anchor the case in certainty, to replace speculation with measurements and timelines. Instead, it unraveled what little stability the investigation still had. The coroner worked in silence longer than usual, repeating steps, recalibrating instruments, checking notes as if an error would eventually reveal itself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying not to sound alarmed. The boy showed no signs of trauma that could explain death in a conventional way. No internal bleeding, no organ failure, no toxins present in the blood. The heart, however, told a different story. According to cellular breakdown, the heart had stopped twice. Once hours before the body was found, and once days earlier. The tissue samples showed conflicting stages of decay, overlapping in ways that should not have been possible within a single body. Time markers contradicted each other, as if two separate deaths had been recorded in the same flesh. The coroner initially suggested contamination or lab error, but repeated tests returned the same results. Even the blood chemistry refused to align with a single moment of death, fluctuating between states that belonged to different points on the clock. The detective stood behind the glass, watching as slides were examined again and again. The room felt colder than it should have, the hum of equipment too loud. When asked to clarify, the coroner chose his words carefully. He said that if he were forced to assign a cause, he would say the boy died of cardiac arrest. But the timing was impossible. One set of indicators placed death before the witness sighting in the ring. Another placed it after. Both were equally convincing. Neither could be dismissed. More unsettling details emerged. Scar tissue on the heart suggested an earlier episode, a moment when the boy should have died but didn't. It was as if the body remembered a death that had failed to complete itself. The lungs showed signs of having breathed after that point. Normal oxygen exchange continuing as though nothing had happened. Life had resumed after stopping, not through intervention, but naturally, quietly, without record. The detective felt a growing unease that this case was not about murder in the traditional sense, but about interruption. When the coroner signed the preliminary report, he hesitated before sealing it. He admitted, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he had never seen time behave like this inside a body. Injuries heal forward. Cells decay forward. Everything moves in one direction. This boy did not. Whatever ended him had reached across moments, touching him more than once, leaving traces that overlapped instead of replacing each other. The detective left the morgue with the certainty that the boy had not simply been killed, but caught between two endings, his death unfinished the first time and corrected the second. As if reality itself had returned to close a mistake it had made earlier. The deeper the detective pushed into sealed archives and forgotten departments, the clearer a pattern began to emerge, one that did not want to be seen. Buried beneath budget reports and obsolete policy memos was evidence of a state-run initiative that officially never existed. It operated under shifting names, each lasting only a few years before being quietly dissolved, then reborn elsewhere. Its purpose, at least on paper, was relocation, moving vulnerable children out of dangerous environments, erasing ties to abusers, granting them clean starts. But the records told a different story, one written in gaps rather than words. Children entered the program without full names, often identified only by approximate age and physical description. Their origins were listed as unknown even when other documents suggested otherwise. Foster placements were temporary, frequently changed, sometimes lasting only weeks before the child was transferred again. School records were deliberately fragmented, medical files split across jurisdictions so no single authority ever held a complete picture. The detective noticed that in many cases, the trail ended abruptly, not with adoption or reunification, but with a final transfer marked by a coded symbol that no longer appeared in modern databases. As he followed those symbols, the corruption became undeniable. Entire folders were missing. Digital files had been overwritten with blank templates, yet access logs showed they had been opened repeatedly over the years. Paper documents had been scanned with key sections cropped out, as if someone wanted proof of existence without allowing comprehension. In some instances, two versions of the same report existed, contradicting each other in subtle ways. Dates altered, signatures changed, conclusions softened. The system had not simply lost these children. It had actively concealed them. What disturbed the detective most was how closely the boy's limited details aligned with the fragments he could still see. Height, age range, behavioral notes describing a child who remembered things he shouldn't, who spoke with certainty about events that had not yet occurred. Staff evaluations hinted at discomfort, even fear, recommending transfers not because of misbehavior, but because caretakers felt watched, studied, anticipated. One memo warned that prolonged placement increased temporal distress, a phrase that had no clear definition and no follow-up explanation. As the detective mapped the data, he realized the relocations formed a pattern of containment rather than care. Children were moved not to protect them, but to isolate them, to prevent attachments, to ensure no one noticed when they vanished. The corruption was not accidental. It was structural, reinforced over decades by people who might not have understood what they were maintaining, only that certain questions were discouraged and certain files were never to be reopened. The boy on the tracks was no anomaly. He was a failure of the system's silence, a child who slipped free of a design meant to keep him perpetually misplaced, remembered by no one and accounted for nowhere. The realization came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, tightening pressure that followed the detective through every document and interview. The boy had not been killed because he was invisible. He had been made invisible because he knew something that could not be allowed to surface. The pattern in the records suggested that children like him were not removed for their safety alone, but for their memories. Notes scattered through the files described recollections that staff dismissed as imagination at first, then quietly documented when the details proved too precise to ignore. The detective began comparing those fragments to real events, fires, disappearances, unexplained policy shifts that had occurred years after the children first mentioned them. In several cases, reports of strange statements had been filed months or even years before the events they described actually took place. A child insisting a building would collapse. Another warning that a caretaker would vanish. At the time, those remarks were classified as delusions or trauma responses. Later, when the events occurred exactly as described, the records went silent. Transfers followed. Redactions multiplied. The children were moved again, farther away, their voices diluted by distance and disbelief. The boy on the tracks fit too neatly into this pattern. Witnesses described him as calm, observant, attentive in a way that unsettled adults. He did not panic in danger. He did not ask questions meant for his age. He listened, as if waiting for confirmation of something he already knew. The detective began to understand that the boy had not been silenced for something he had done, but for something he was about to say. A memory forming. a realization nearing language. Whatever he remembered had reached a point where it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. This explained the care taken before his death. The clean hands. The lack of struggle. Someone had approached him not as an executioner, but as a handler fulfilling a final procedure. The system that had failed to contain him had corrected itself. The boy had been allowed to live until the moment he became dangerous, not physically, but narratively, until his knowledge threatened to connect dots that had been kept separate for decades. His death was not an act of anger. It was a preventative measure. As the detective replayed the witness testimony in his mind, the boy's calm expression took on a new meaning. He may have known this was coming. He may have understood that saying what he knew would accelerate an ending he had already felt approaching. The autopsy's impossible timeline now made a terrible kind of sense. The boy's death had begun the moment his memory crossed an invisible threshold, and it had only been completed when silence was finally assured. The detective realized he was no longer chasing a murderer, but a mechanism designed to erase truths before they could be spoken, and the boy had been its most recent correction, eliminated not for his past, but for the future he carried within him. The final connection revealed itself in a way that felt less like discovery and more like recognition. As the detective reviewed the access logs again, tracing the repeated appearances of his own credentials across decades, he began to understand that this was not an intrusion from outside the system. It was continuity. His name surfaced in moments when critical files were sealed, when transfers were approved without explanation, when investigations quietly stalled. At first, he told himself it was coincidence, the result of a reused identifier or corrupted data. But the deeper he looked, the more personal the pattern became. He found an old personnel evaluation from his early years on the force, a document he did not remember authoring but bore his digital signature. It praised his discretion, his instinct for knowing when not to pursue certain leads, his ability to close cases efficiently without provoking oversight. At the time, he had thought it was bureaucratic flattery. Now he saw it as recruitment. He had been selected not because he asked good questions, but because he knew when to stop asking them. Somewhere along the way, he had learned the rules without ever being told them. The most devastating proof came from a childhood record buried so deeply it should have been inaccessible. A partial intake form from a defunct social services office listed a boy brought in for questioning after making disturbing temporal statements. The intake officer's name was redacted, but the emergency contact was not. It was the detective's father. The address matched the house where the detective had grown up. The date placed the event just months before a period of his childhood he could barely remember, years that felt smoothed over, stripped of detail. Fragments began to surface. A memory of sitting in a hallway that smelled like disinfectant. A voice telling him not to repeat what he'd heard. A sense, even then, that knowing too much could make people disappear. He understood now that he had been close to becoming one of those children, close enough that the system had marked him, then decided he was more useful preserved than erased. He had grown into his role unknowingly, becoming a caretaker of silence rather than a victim of it. The boy on the tracks had followed the same path, but without the same outcome. Where the detective had learned to forget, the boy had remembered. Where the detective had been guided away from dangerous truths, the boy had carried them forward. That difference had sealed the boy's fate. The case had not found the detective by chance. It had returned to him because he was part of its unfinished business. Solving it meant confronting the possibility that his career had been shaped to prevent exactly this kind of reckoning, and that by pursuing the truth now, he was stepping out of alignment with a system that had once spared him, a system that might not offer the same mercy twice.